I remember that September morning with a clarity I can't shake. The sun was just brushing the tops of the Appalachian ridges, turning the fog into pale silver ribbons between the trees. My partner, an EMT named Jason, and I were dispatched to a hunting accident. The GPS had us on a logging road 2 miles past where the pavement ended, and then it blinked out entirely, leaving us with nothing but the rough map on our tablet and a sense of isolation that settled in my stomach. The call had come in just before dawn. A hunter had fallen and injured his leg. That's what they said. Standard response. Nothing in my training prepared me for what followed. We parked the rig at the edge of the road where the forest began thick and dark. The tires crunched on gravel as we pulled the stretchers and packs free. Jason moved ahead, scanning the ground, and I followed close behind, trying to keep my balance on the loose soil that fell away sharply on either side of the narrow logging road. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with the faint tang of old pine resin. Every so often, a bird would call, a woodpecker's hammering echoing off the distant hills, but there was no wind. The forest felt impossibly still. The first clue was a thin trail of blood drops. They were small, bright, and irregularly spaced, winding between the ferns and fallen branches. They led off the road and into the thick undergrowth. I adjusted my gloves and checked my pack for supplies. Jason's flashlight cut through the shadows, catching on wet leaves and rocks as we moved. Each step required caution. The uneven terrain could turn a simple fall into a real injury, which weighed on my mind more than I wanted. After about 10 minutes, the drop stopped. The trail didn't end, it changed. There were drag marks etched into the soil, faint at first, then deeper as we followed them uphill. My heart rate picked up. The slope was steep, littered with moss-covered roots that reached like twisted hands across the path. I could feel the strain in my legs as I climbed, the pack pressing against my shoulders. Jason was ahead, hands on his knees, moving carefully. There was no sound except our breathing and the soft crush of leaves beneath boots. We found him sitting against a tree, pale, shaking, and rigid. His hunting jacket was torn along the calf, revealing deep wounds that looked like claws, the skin raw and ragged. The smell was coppery, thick with blood. I could see the panic in his eyes. He didn't need to explain, though his words were muttered repeatedly, fragments I could barely make out. I knelt beside him, assessed the leg, and stabilized it with a splint from my pack. The way he sat, almost curling into himself, made it clear he had been dragged or had tried to crawl. He was sweating, trembling, barely conscious at times. As I worked, I noticed the forest around us was quieter than it had been before. No birds, no insects, nothing that moved. The usual noises of the Appalachians, the wind through leaves, the snap of small animals, had vanished. Only the faint rustle of branches overhead suggested movement, but it wasn't the wind. My stomach tightened. I kept scanning the trees, every shadow a possible threat. Jason finished securing the patient to the stretcher. I checked his vital signs again. Blood pressure was low, heart rate rapid, the pulse thready. Nothing about his condition was extraordinary except for the mental state. He was hyper-alert, terrified. His story didn't make sense at first, just fragments of fear repeated. He said it had stood up when he shot it. My training told me to stay calm, focus on the patient, but the phrase echoed in my mind as we prepared to move him. The climb back to the road was worse. Every step was calculated, the stretcher rocking slightly as we navigated roots and loose stones. My arms burned. Jason's face was tight, the same tension I felt, though we didn't speak. The patient's leg bled through the dressing despite my efforts. I kept pressure applied while watching every flicker of movement in the treeline. Something was following us. The sound was subtle at first, heavy, slow steps that pressed into the soft soil but never approached directly. I could hear them behind us, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right. Not constant, but deliberate. We paused once to catch our breath, the stretcher resting on a fallen log. The patient's eyes were wide, staring uphill where the shadows seemed to shift. He whispered again, the words barely audible. It moved. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The tension pressed in, tight as a vice. The silence of the forest amplified every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn around and see what was there, but training held me in place. We reached the clearing at the top of the hill. The road was visible again, washed in morning light that fell in broken patches through the trees. I set the stretcher down, checked the patient's vitals, and called dispatch to report our location. Jason kept scanning the perimeter, unease written on his face. He and I shared a glance that said everything without words. The walk back from here was still long, and the woods felt like they had eyes. When the ambulance finally appeared, its engine cutting through the stillness, I helped lift the patient in. He barely reacted, still pale, still trembling. I monitored his vitals as Jason secured the 4-line. The ride back down the winding road to the main highway was silent except for the mechanical hum of the rig and the occasional crack of a turning gear. Later, back at the station, I replayed the incident in my head. The scratches on the patient's leg didn't match any reported animal activity in the area. Bears had been absent for years. Coyotes were present, but never that large. The dragging marks and the way he described what happened suggested a fall. Yes, but there was more, a presence in the forest, deliberate and patient, that we never saw. I didn't sleep that night. I could still hear the heavy steps in the distance, the slow, rhythmic pressure of something moving just beyond vision. The Appalachian forest is old and quiet, and sometimes it keeps its secrets well. The patient recovered physically, but the terror in his eyes lingered. I think about him often. I think about the sounds in the trees, the way the fog thickened as we moved uphill, the absence of normal forest life around us. In the years since, I've been on many calls, some rough, some routine, but nothing felt as visceral, as personal, as that morning in the woods. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a story for shock value, it was real. The woods call in ways you can't always explain. It's the isolation, the unpredictability of terrain, the sheer unknown of what can happen when someone falls out of sight of civilization. That day, we were reminded that the forest doesn't care who you are. It doesn't negotiate. It just observes. And sometimes, if you're not careful, it follows. Even now, when I pass a dense section of Appalachian forest on a quiet road, I slow down. I look at the trees, the shadows, the slope of the land. I remember the trail of blood, the drag marks, the fear in a man's eyes, and the feeling of being watched without ever seeing who or what is watching. It stays with you. It doesn't fade. It's part of the job, part of the reality of working in the wild where accidents happen, and help takes time to arrive. And sometimes the forest is not empty. It waits. I remember that week in March 2015 like a weight pressing against my chest. The city was still waking from winter, the sidewalks damp, the air heavy with the smell of thawing salt and exhaust. My partner and I, a 2-person unit running a beat through a dense stretch of Chicago, had been called to the same apartment 3 times already that week. Apartment 3B. Each time, it was a hang-up call. The dispatcher's voice was flat but clipped, a routine that carried no urgency at first. The first call came late on Monday, just past midnight. We got there, knocked on the door, announced ourselves, no answer. No movement. No sound except the faint hum of the radiator through the thin walls of the corridor. We checked the windows from the hall, nothing. Empty hallway, quiet stairwell. My partner shrugged it off. We left, marked the call as false, the kind of thing that happened more than you would think in a city this size. By Wednesday, we were back. Same apartment, same circumstances. The dispatcher had warned us. 3rd call in the week, no answer. Again, silence when we knocked. The door was locked, the kind of sturdy metal that doesn't give way to polite persuasion. We pressed our ears against it, tapped, but nothing. No shuffling inside, no whisper, no sound of a person breathing. It was only a little strange then, the kind of thing you note and move on from. We circled the building once, checked the rear exit, no signs of life. The hallway smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals, nothing out of the ordinary for a city apartment. Thursday brought the 4th call. This time, police were already on site when we arrived, and they weren't taking chances. They forced entry before we got out of the ambulance, battering the door with a small ram and sliding a slim crowbar under the frame. The door swung open with a muffled groan that echoed through the narrow corridor. I followed behind the officers, flashlight cutting through the gloom. The apartment was nearly empty. The walls were bare, the carpet thin and gray, the windows closed and dusty. In the middle of the main room lay a mattress, stained and sagging, the kind that had been carried in decades before and left behind. On the floor next to it, a single phone, black and featureless, still connected to 911. The timer on the screen ticked quietly, 18 minutes. I walked around the mattress slowly, careful not to step on the phone cord. There was nothing else. No dishes, no personal items, not a single scrap of paper, No trash, no indication anyone had lived here recently. The dust on the windowsills was thick, undisturbed, and the faint pattern of footprints leading away from the mattress suggested someone had left the room in a hurry, though the footprints stopped abruptly at the far wall. The place smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't place, a kind of acrid, chemical tang that made the back of my throat tighten. I checked each room systematically, moving from the living space to the bedroom, then into the small kitchen. The cabinets were empty, the sink clean but dry, the refrigerator still plugged in but devoid of food, frost clinging in small patches to the back. We stayed there for almost an hour. Police canvassed the floor, checked for signs of forced entry from other units, but found nothing. No neighbors had seen anyone enter or leave, and the building's security cameras, outdated as they were, showed the hallway empty at all hours that week. We bagged the phone as evidence, careful to note its ongoing connection to 911. Dispatch confirmed the calls, their logs matching ours exactly. No voice, no background noise, just the timer running and the line open, waiting for someone who wasn't there. Later that night, after the building had quieted and we'd returned to the station, dispatch sent another alert. Caller location, apartment 3B. My stomach sank. We had just left. The call wasn't from a new device. The line traced back to the same number the dispatcher confirmed was the one we'd collected earlier. I didn't know if I felt disbelief or a rising sense of dread. My partner and I drove out again, the streets slick with melting snow, lights reflected in puddles that smelled faintly of oil and rust. At the building, we spoke with the manager. He was a middle-aged man, face drawn, tired from months of managing old units like this. He told us 3B had been vacant for 8 months. Vacant. The phone shouldn't have been active, shouldn't have been producing calls, shouldn't have been in the apartment at all. I glanced at my partner. His expression mirrored mine. We had been through emergencies that made the city seem endless and indifferent, but this was different. This was quiet, deliberate, empty. We searched the unit again, systematically, tracing every corner, every crevice. Nothing. The mattress sagged in the same place. The phone was still dead on the floor, still powered, still somehow connected. The silence pressed against our ears, heavier than any winter wind outside. I left the building that night with a nagging, unsettled feeling, the kind that doesn't leave even when the city roars around you. There were no answers, no explanation, just a quiet, absurdly still apartment and a phone that had made us run across town for nothing. Yet something about it felt intentional, waiting, observing in its own way. We never got another call from 3B after that week. The unit remained vacant, the phone removed by the building manager. But for the rest of my career, I carried the memory of that mattress, that phone, and the empty apartment in a quiet corner of my mind. Every time I passed an abandoned apartment, a half-open door, I remembered 3B and the emptiness that had felt almost alive in its silence, waiting. I remember the night clearly, the kind that settles into your chest before you even realize it. It was November 2017, just after 2 in the morning, and my partner and I had been cruising a long stretch of dark, rural Ohio road when dispatch sent us out for a welfare check. The call had come in vague. An elderly man reportedly collapsed. The caller hung up before providing any details, so we didn't know if we were walking into a medical emergency or just a false alarm. The address was 20 minutes out of town, down a gravel road with no streetlights. The night was cold, the kind that makes every tree and fence post stand out sharply against the darkness, and the wind had that dry, brittle quality that seemed to whisper over the fields. By the time we arrived, the farmhouse was nothing more than a silhouette against the faint glow of the moon. The house itself had that abandoned feel, the kind that makes you notice every crooked shutter, every sag in the roof. No lights were on, no movement. The gravel crunched under our boots as we approached, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet night. I could feel my chest tighten slightly, not panic, but that awareness that comes when you know something is off. My partner and I knocked, called out nothing. No answer. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with a soft creak. Inside, the air hit us first. Stale, heavy, like the place had been sealed for months. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams of our flashlights. Furniture was draped in sheets, the fabric yellowed and stiff, some edges fraying. The floorboards groaned underfoot. I noticed the kitchen first. Plates stacked neatly, a coffee pot coated in a thin film of dust, the smell faintly sour from whatever had been left in it. No power, No heat, the cold settling into our bones quickly. It was the kind of quiet that presses down on you, so complete it makes your own breathing feel loud. Then the radio crackled. Dispatch came back on, their voice calm but firm. They told us to cancel. The caller had reported the patient deceased, coroner already notified earlier that day. We paused, exchanging a look, the hair on my neck prickling. 6 hours earlier, the man had been pronounced dead at the hospital. The hospital records, the coroner, the paperwork, it all lined up. No one from this address had called. That alone should have been enough to turn us around, to make this a routine false alarm. But something in the silence kept us rooted. We moved through the house slowly, methodical, checking the main floor. The bedroom doors were closed, sheets over the bed, everything untouched. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and decay, a subtle mixture that made my stomach tighten. My flashlight passed over a framed photograph on a dresser. An elderly man, sharp eyes, a thin smile. It felt like it was staring right at me. I shook my head, ignored the feeling. As we prepared to leave, the unit's tablet pinged, refreshing automatically. A new incoming call. Same address. Caller ID showed the deceased man's name. My partner froze, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. I felt the cold wash over me again, but it wasn't fear, it was disbelief, a calculation running through my mind. There was no practical explanation, not yet. Phones can glitch, caller IDs can be spoofed. Everything about it was improbable, but not impossible. We checked the logs. The timestamp was precise, 2:17 a.m., just 1 minute before our arrival. There was no one to answer. No one had been there. Everything outside was as it had been, dark, still empty. We scoured the property, the fields surrounding it, the barn, the driveway, every conceivable place someone could hide. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of life. Eventually, we called it in. We documented everything: dispatch, coroner, hospital records. The call went into the books as unverified. It wasn't dramatic, no sirens or chases, no violent struggle. Just a house, dark and empty, and a phone line that seemed to record a life that no longer existed. On the drive back, my partner and I didn't speak much. The road stretched long and quiet ahead, the fields on either side black and empty. When we got back to town, I thought about the photograph, the bed, the stale air. Everything was normal, yet nothing felt right. I still think about that night, not as something supernatural, but as a reminder that even the most mundane places can hold a puzzle that defies explanation. The house had called twice, and the truth was there was no one to answer, but the record of the call remained, a perfect, real imprint of a moment that should never have happened. I remember the call like it was a weight pressing down in my chest. February mornings were always gray, the sky low and heavy, and the roads slick with leftover ice. The nursing home was tucked on a quiet street, one of those places you could drive past a dozen times and barely notice. My partner and I pulled up to the small lot, the engine idling, lights dim in the low fog. The building looked empty, the kind of quiet that makes every step echo. We grabbed our gear, checked the stretcher, the monitor, the bag with the usual assortment of syringes and pads. There was no rush yet, just that steady tension you carry in your bones before you know what's waiting inside. The staff met us at the door, nervous, glancing behind them. They led us down a narrow hallway with the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Each door we passed had a little window, frosted and scratched from decades of cleaning. The smell was faint but sharp, clean linen, antiseptic, and the lingering metallic tang that seemed to come from somewhere deep in old buildings. When they reached room 12, they stopped, and we stepped in. The room was small, the bed pushed against the wall, rails up, a thin blanket folded back. The patient lay there, head turned slightly to one side. She was already cold, the skin hardening with the first stages of rigor mortis. Her hair was wispy gray, tangled against the pillow. Her hands were pale and stiff on the blanket. There was a small table next to the bed with an untouched cup of water and a few personal items, a photo, a small figurine. Everything in the room seemed suspended, the way a single breath could disturb the quiet and make it feel wrong. We went through the motions, checking her pulse, the monitor, listening, confirming. It was definitive. She had been gone long enough for the cold to settle in her skin, but not so long that the room had started to feel abandoned. I could smell the faint mix of antiseptic and old sweat, the remnants of a life in a confined space. While we worked, a nurse lingered near the door, frowning. She looked confused, almost hesitant, and I realized she hadn't called us. That didn't make sense. Dispatch had the call, the time, the details. My partner and I exchanged a glance and walked over to the phone on the small table. It was off the hook, disconnected from the wall. No cord, no dial tone, nothing. The thought pressed down hard. The call had come from this room, from the phone that was now useless. The patient had advanced dementia, unable to speak for weeks, unresponsive to staff. She had no way of dialing, no way of understanding. And yet the call had gone through. The time on the call showed 1 minute and 32 seconds, long enough for someone or something to make the connection, and short enough that it ended without anyone on the other end realizing. The room settled around us as we moved through the procedures, the sheets folded back over her, the monitors packed away. I felt the weight of stillness, the way the air clung to the corners, the faint ticking of the clock amplified against the quiet. The nurse kept glancing at the wall phone, as though it might explain itself if she looked hard enough. My partner and I said nothing. There was no need. The work was mechanical now, the same routine that never changes, but the room held something impossible to ignore. We left with the stretcher empty, the cold lingering on our hands, the floor clean but marked with faint impressions where our boots pressed down. The fog had thickened outside, and our lights cast long streaks across the lot. No one said anything on the drive back, just the hum of the engine and the dull ache in my arms. The phone stayed in my mind, the impossibility of it. A call from a patient who could not speak, could not lift a hand, could not comprehend. The quiet weight of that fact settled deep, a reminder that even in the ordinary, controlled world of medicine, there are moments that refuse explanation, moments that are entirely human and entirely impossible to forget. I have returned to similar calls, seen the cold of death, the rigidity of time, the procedural certainty, but nothing has ever left me with that same tight knot in my chest. It was not fear of ghosts or monsters. It was the unsettling reminder that life, and the end of it, sometimes moves without notice, without reason, and the echoes can linger longer than anyone expects. I was the only unit responding that night, a solo run in a quick-response SUV. The storm had been building all afternoon, the kind of blizzard where the wind cuts through every layer you put on and snow drifts form faster than you can drive. The interstate in northern New Mexico was nearly deserted, the kind of silence that presses against your chest when headlights catch only white. I had just passed mile marker 42 when dispatch called a single vehicle crash near mile marker 46. The coordinates put it in a shallow ditch just beyond a curve where the highway drops slightly and the desert stretches flat and empty on either side. I found the truck half buried in snow, its tires pressed into the icy ditch. The driver, a man in his 40s, was sitting stiffly behind the wheel. His face was pale, his eyes wide and darting. He smelled of cold and gasoline, the interior of the truck warm enough to fog the windows from the heat of his breath. He didn't make a sound at first, just stared out into the storm. I pulled the SUV over, engaged the emergency lights, and climbed out. The wind shredded my jacket and made every movement deliberate and slow. I approached the pickup and called out, letting him know who I was. He nodded faintly, but didn't answer any of my questions about how the crash had happened. Instead, his gaze drifted past me toward the empty expanse of desert, and he whispered something that didn't make sense at first. He kept asking if I had seen something run across the snow. I scanned the area. There were no tracks other than those left by his vehicle, the wind having erased anything smaller. I crouched down in the drifted snow beside the truck and checked the ground. The only tracks were my own boot prints and the disturbed snow around the ditch. The storm muffled every sound, the wind whistling over the highway like it had its own pulse. As I assessed him, I noticed the prints in the snow. They had come from the empty desert, emerged into the area in front of the truck, made a slow loop around the vehicle, and returned in the same direction they had come. The shape didn't make sense. Too long for a human stride, too narrow for any animal I could identify. The snow had partially filled them in, but the outline remained distinct enough to be unsettling. I made a mental note of the pattern, careful not to alarm the man further. He shivered, and I handed him my thermal blanket, feeling the cold seep into my fingers as I adjusted the straps around his shoulders. He refused to be transported until I promised we wouldn't leave him alone at the scene. I radioed dispatch to send a tow and another unit, but the storm was heavy, and the response would be delayed. Once I started the SUV toward the hospital, the highway became a tunnel of white. Visibility dropped to 50 feet, and the headlights cut through swirls of snow that made every marker post a vague shadow. I kept my speed moderate, tires crunching on compacted snow. The man stared forward, rigid, speaking only in fragmented questions, asking if the back doors were locked. I checked the locks quickly, trying to calm him. I hadn't touched them. The flashing rear door alarm made my stomach tighten. I hit the unlock button, opened the back doors, and saw that nothing had shifted. Nothing had been placed in the cargo area. The storm had probably set the sensor off, I reasoned, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The man's eyes never left the doors. His fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles white. He muttered under his breath as I drove, tense and still. Every mile marker passed slowly, the storm relentless, the highway stretching out like an unbroken white ribbon. When we reached the hospital, he insisted I stay with him until he was safely inside. I guided him down the slippery steps, supporting his weight against mine, the wind cutting through the open vestibule as we entered. Nurses and security took over immediately, and I finally stepped back, letting them handle the paperwork and triage. I watched the snow pile against the doors, saw the tracks I had noted earlier now gone under fresh drift. I returned to my SUV, hands shaking despite gloves, and drove back into the storm. The highway was empty again, white and silent, but the image of those prints lingered. They hadn't been human, they hadn't been animal, and they were gone in minutes, as if the desert had swallowed them whole. I couldn't explain it. The crash had been routine, but something about that night, about the desert and the storm, and the looped tracks that came and went on their own, stayed with me. I filed my report normally, checked the vehicle sensors again, and kept my eyes on the road. I never saw anything else, but I felt the weight of it, like a presence that had circled the truck and disappeared before anyone else arrived. The night was unusually quiet for December, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. The streets were slick with melting snow, reflecting the weak yellow glow of the streetlights. My partner and I had been running calls steadily since the shift began, the usual mix of falls, fainting, and chronic conditions, but nothing that felt urgent. Around 3 a.m, dispatch cut in with a call that felt ordinary at first, an unknown medical at a residential address. I glanced at the screen, noting the address. It didn't match any familiar routes. My partner pulled the rig onto the main road, and we started moving, lights off, letting the city's shadows stretch over us. Dispatch read back the caller ID. I felt my stomach knot immediately. It was my personal cell number. I flipped my phone open, scanning the call log. There were no outgoing calls, no recent activity except the usual notifications from the apps I ignored. I set it down on the dash, trying to push the unease aside. My partner noticed my pause but didn't comment. There was nothing to say anyway. The call could be a misdial, an error in the system. The address was an abandoned house at the edge of a block scheduled for demolition. Boarded windows, a sagging roof, the sort of place that looked like it had been left to rot for decades. We pulled the rig into the street, the tires crunching over ice and gravel. The wind had picked up, slipping through gaps in the boarded windows, carrying a faint metallic scent, rust, old wood, something dead beneath it. I stepped out, gloves in place, flashlight cutting through the darkness. My partner followed. Inside, the air was cold in a way that settled into your bones. Dust hung in shafts of our flashlight beams, motes moving lazily in the stillness. There was no furniture, no signs of recent habitation. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floors littered with debris, the faint smell of mildew and stagnant water thick. We swept room by room, methodical, professional, checking corners and closets. No one was there. No patient. No signs of anyone having been there recently. My stomach tightened. I checked my phone again. A missed call from 911 flashed on the screen, time-stamped 3:06 a.m., a minute before dispatch had routed us. My hands went cold. There was no way that was possible. The number was mine, the call originated from my line, but the timing didn't add up. I tapped the screen, tried to return the call, nothing connected. My partner was finishing the sweep of the last room and signaled we were clear. As we stepped back onto the front porch, the radio crackled. Dispatch's voice was calm, but the words made my stomach drop. Caller reports you're already inside and need help. I looked around. The street was empty. The house was silent. There was no one else on the block. The cold pressed in, the wind skimming over the cracked pavement, whistling through the gaps in the boards. My partner and I exchanged a glance, both of us rigid, scanning for something, anything that made sense. There was nothing. We backed carefully down the sidewalk, keeping our eyes on the darkened windows. My phone stayed in my hand, the missed call still visible. I didn't try to call back. Whatever had triggered it wasn't human, not in any way I could confirm or confront. We returned to the rig and sat for a moment, letting the engine run, listening to the clicks and hums of the radio. The city was waking in subtle ways, an occasional car passing, a distant dog barking, but nothing that explained the call. I finally put the phone down, not wanting to touch it again for fear of triggering something else, and we drove away slowly, headlights cutting through the frozen fog of the streetlights. Back at the station, I ran through the logs and radio records, trying to find a technical explanation. The system showed no call from my number, no one reporting an active emergency at that location. Everything was clean, normal. The timing didn't match, the number didn't match, and yet the call had come through. I filed the incident in the system, marked it as unverified, and went home hours later, still in my uniform, still carrying the chill from that empty house. Weeks later, I checked my phone again, half expecting something to repeat. Nothing. The number had never called itself again. The house was eventually demolished, leaving nothing but flattened concrete and splintered wood. I never solved what happened that night, but I stopped checking the call log before bed. I didn't need confirmation. I knew what I had seen, or not seen, and that was enough. The memory of that empty house, the missed call, the voice on the radio describing me inside when I wasn't, stayed with me. I still work nights, still respond to calls. I still pass that block occasionally, glancing at the vacant lot, the wind brushing across the pavement, and I feel it, that same knot in my stomach, that same quiet sense that some things don't have answers, and some calls aren't meant to be returned. I remember the call like it was burned into my memory. August heat still heavy in the air, a slow, humid press against our skin as we rolled through the quiet streets toward the edge of town. The dispatch report was simple: a child not waking up at a sawmill property. Nothing about the trailer behind the mill, nothing about what we'd find there. Our 3-person night unit moved quickly, lights muted, siren only a brief warning to break the silence of the empty lots we passed. The road narrowed and the smell of sawdust and rot hit us before we saw the property. The mill itself was dark, long abandoned, rotting boards and rusted metal framing a skeleton of machinery that had once been alive with the scent of fresh-cut timber. At the far edge, a single trailer rested alone, far enough from the mill to be private, close enough that the weeds and dirt around it looked trampled but uncared for. The generator sat outside, coughing out noise and diesel fumes. Its light cast long shadows across the lot, shadows that moved with the low breeze but seemed to shift with some other intent, the way darkness always does when you're waiting for something you can't see. The trailer's metal siding was scratched and faded, windows opaque with dust and grime. My partner and I exchanged a brief glance but didn't speak. We'd seen enough by now to know that silence could hide everything. Inside, the heat was immediate and thick, a wall pressing against my chest as we stepped past the screen door. The trailer smelled of dust, sweat, and decay, undercut by the acrid tang of something old, something sick. The mother sat on the floor with 3 children, all small, all still. They didn't move when we came in. The air felt brittle, fragile, as if even breathing too hard might shatter it. The smallest child lay limp, skin drawn tight over bones, lips pale and dry. Dehydration was evident in the sag of cheeks and the hollows beneath eyes, and my heart sank into that pit in my stomach you only get on calls that shouldn't be survivable. I dropped to my knees beside the child, checking vitals, pulse faint, almost ghost-like, lungs shallow, struggling to expand. Cardiac arrest. I shouted for the monitor and oxygen, while my partner prepared for access and our 3rd teammate controlled the mother, who repeated herself over and over, eyes wide and frantic, words bleeding into the air. They won't talk anymore, they won't talk anymore. Time slowed. The generator hummed, a low constant backdrop, filling the spaces where a normal home's sounds would exist. The children didn't make a sound. Their eyes followed us occasionally, but mostly they stayed silent, a quiet that felt deliberate, oppressive. While I worked compressions into the tiny chest, feeling the resistance of a body too weak to fight, one of the older kids leaned forward slightly and whispered something to my partner. I didn't catch the words at first, the sound almost swallowed by the machine's growl, but the shift in my partner's posture made me glance up. Eyes wide frozen, the kid's words carried a warning. Don't turn the generator off. He comes when it's quiet. My stomach tightened. I didn't ask, didn't respond. There was no time for that. There was only the child, only the work in front of us. Minutes stretched into eternity. The airway was suctioned, the 4-line established, the monitor's beeps echoing into the dim corners of the trailer. Every breath, every movement carried the weight of urgency and dread. I tried to ignore the unease creeping along the edges of my mind, the feeling that we weren't entirely alone in that space. The mother's voice, low and repetitive, became another pulse against the generator's rhythm, and the silence of the other children pressed down like a physical weight. Eventually, we got the heart beating, weak but steady. My partner maintained oxygen while I moved to assess the environment, glancing at the older children and the mother, seeing the exhaustion and fear that had nothing to do with this night, seeing neglect and trauma in every line of their bodies. Outside, the property was still, the shed behind the trailer just a dark shape in the shadows. Later we would learn that an unrelated man had been living there, hidden away, alone, unknown, possibly for months. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had known. We stabilized the child and loaded him into the ambulance, the mother in tow, the older children following reluctantly. I kept my eyes on the trailer until the doors closed, the generator still running, humming a protective insistence. The lot fell silent again, the mill looming behind it, empty, decaying, waiting. That night stayed with me, the quiet and the warning, the way neglect and hidden lives can intersect with ours in ways we cannot predict. When we left, the property seemed smaller, human-sized in its horrors, but it left a shadow in my memory that I still feel when I picture that night and the children who didn't speak. The child survived. He went to a hospital that could manage severe dehydration and trauma. The mother faced intervention, and the older children were removed for care. The man in the shed was taken into custody, an unknown resident with no apparent ties to the family, a ghost in plain sight. Months later, I still think about that trailer, the generator humming, the quiet that carried a warning, the fragile silence of children who had learned to wait, and the way life and danger can sit side by side in the most ordinary, broken spaces. I remember the call that morning with a clarity that still unsettles me. The sky over Kansas was overcast, heavy clouds pressing down on the fields, turning everything a dull gray-green. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, tense, grain auger, entrapment, remote location. My partner and I loaded our gear onto the volunteer truck and headed out, the road a ribbon of cracked asphalt between endless cornfields. By the time we reached the turnoff, the grass on either side had grown tall and wet with morning dew, brushing against the sides of the truck. The smell of damp earth and fertilizer was sharp in the air, mixed with the faint odor of animals from nearby barns. When we pulled onto the gravel drive, the barn came into view. A faded red structure, weathered boards warped from years of sun and wind, its roof sagging slightly. The farmer was outside, leaning on the doorframe, one leg clearly caught in the machinery. His face was pale, tight with pain, and his hands clutched at the auger as if letting go would make him vanish. He kept glancing toward the loft, toward the shadows in the upper part of the barn, muttering about another man. My stomach turned. At first, I assumed panic, confusion from the injury, but there was a steadiness in his gaze, a tension that didn't belong to simple fear. We set our equipment down carefully. The volunteers were quiet, methodical, but the unease in the air was palpable. As we assessed the injury, the farmer's eyes never left the loft, and he kept murmuring about someone watching, someone there. There was no one to be seen, and yet the instinctive chill settled over me. The barn was old, its wood thick and hollow in parts, letting the wind slip through in low whistles. The machinery groaned under stress as we began extricating him. Each movement had to be precise. One wrong shift could crush bone, tear flesh. We worked slowly, calling out positions and instructions, but even the efficiency couldn't erase the sense that we weren't alone. Halfway through, one of the volunteers paused. She crouched near the auger and pointed to the ground. Fresh boot prints, dark against the dusty floor, circled the machine. They were large, heavy, recent. My partner's jaw tightened. The farmer said he lived alone. The closest neighbor was miles away, separated by fields and fence lines. The prints didn't match anyone in our crew, not a single one. They circled and disappeared toward the barn walls, toward the loft. My throat tightened. I wiped sweat from my brow and tried to focus on the extrication. The farmer's breathing was shallow, pain etched into every line of his body, but his eyes kept darting toward the shadows above. Finally, we freed his leg, wrapped it, and loaded him onto the stretcher. The air in the barn seemed heavier, thicker, as if the old wood had absorbed every moment of fear we carried in. The farmer continued looking upward until we closed the doors behind him. On the ride back to the station, the road seemed impossibly long. His gaze stayed fixed on the rearview mirror, never on me, never on the volunteers. He spoke again of the other man, of nights spent feeling watched, of someone hiding in the loft. His words were quiet, not frantic, but deliberate, carrying a weight that made the truck feel smaller than it was. Law enforcement arrived later that day. They searched the barn thoroughly, examining the loft. What they found confirmed the farmer's fears. There were signs that someone had been living up there for weeks. Makeshift bedding tucked into corners, food wrappers, scraps of clothing, and discarded personal items. No one could identify the person. No prints beyond the ones that trailed through the barn floor. No fingerprints on the machinery. The farmer insisted on staying nearby while they investigated, pacing the yard, eyes flicking constantly to the barn. The volunteers and I left with a quiet heaviness, the smell of damp earth and old wood lingering in our hair and clothes. Months later, I still think about that day. About the prints that circled the machinery, about the loft where someone had hidden, about the way the farmer's gaze seemed to pierce through the shadows long after the truck had driven away. The authorities never found the person. The farmer moved his routines, but he never felt safe in the barn again. Every creak in the floor, every shadow in the loft, reminded him, and through his recounting, reminded me, that someone had been there, silent, unseen, waiting. The machinery injury healed, the barn remained, but the presence, real in its subtlety, left a mark that no report or investigation could erase. It was tangible in the air, in the way the wind slipped through the boards, in the way people vanish in plain sight when the world is wide and quiet enough.